Can you believe how many things the wholesome 1950s tried to ban? In a decade obsessed with good manners and clean living, even music, fashion, and fun could cross a line no one dared step over. What were they so afraid of losing beneath all that perfection? It is hard to believe that something as simple as a dance move could terrify a nation, but that is exactly what happened when Elvis Presley first appeared on television. When he shook his hips and curled his lip, it was as if America's living room had caught fire. Ministers preached about sin, parents rushed to turn off the set, and newspapers warned of moral decay. His movements were described as obscene, animalistic, even dangerous to the minds of young girls. But for teenagers, it felt like freedom, a beat that belonged to them alone. Networks responded by filming him only from the waist up, trying to contain what they could not control. Elvis was not trying to start a revolution, but in a decade obsessed with restraint, even a wiggle could feel like rebellion. The world was changing, and the censors were terrified of what that rhythm meant. Rock and roll was not just banned from classrooms, it was practically treated as a disease. School boards across America called it jungle rhythm, claiming it turned polite children into delinquents. Dances were shut down, records confiscated, and principals lectured about moral collapse. The music pulsed with something new: energy, independence, and danger, and adults did not know how to contain it. For teens, though, it was oxygen. Rock and roll in a school gymnasium meant escape, sweat, and the sound of growing up. By banning it, authorities only made it more powerful. Every rhythm they tried to silence echoed louder in the hearts of the young. Comic books about crime and horror were once seen as pure entertainment, until adults decided they were the enemy. In the early 1950s, titles like Tales from the Crypt and crime suspense stories filled spinner racks, thrilling readers with murder and monsters. Then came the panic. Psychiatrists and senators claimed these comics were warping children's minds and feeding a wave of juvenile crime. Public burnings were organized, and terrified parents threw away stacks of them overnight. The outcry led to the Comics Code Authority, a strict set of rules that erased blood, fear, and moral ambiguity from the page. Overnight, an art form went from rebellious to sanitized. The wild imagination of America's youth had been declared unsafe. When James Dean appeared in Rebel Without a Cause, his smoldering stare and defiant silence captured the restlessness of an entire generation. But to conservative towns, that was exactly the problem. Several communities banned the movie, saying it glorified teenage rebellion and disrespected authority. The film's broken families, fast cars, and angry youth felt too real for comfort. Parents wanted clean lessons, not mirrors held up to their own fears. But James Dean was not the problem. He was the reflection. The ban only proved how fragile the 1950s dream of perfect families really was. Beneath the calm suburbs, something wild was growing, and Dean had simply given it a face. Elvis Presley's early records were not just scandalous, they were confusing. Here was a white singer performing songs that sounded unmistakably black, with the swagger of rhythm and blues and the fire of gospel. In a segregated America, that made him both adored and feared. Southern stations banned his music for blurring racial lines, while moral crusaders condemned it for stirring lust. He was too white for some, too black for others, and too alive for the censors. What they did not understand was that the sound itself was a kind of rebellion, one that crossed color, class, and culture. Every beat of his song said what polite society refused to admit, that the world was changing, and music was leading the way. Movies showing interracial romance were treated like a national scandal. In several states, theaters refused to screen them altogether, and censors cut out entire scenes of affection between black and white actors. To the moral gatekeepers, such images were dangerous propaganda. But for the few who managed to see them, these films were glimpses of a future still out of reach. In a decade that claimed to be modern and moral, love itself was put on trial. The ban said more about the fears of the era than any film ever could. It revealed the fragile seams holding America's ideals together. and the price of crossing them. Across parts of the South, African American artists vanished from the airwaves. Radio stations quietly stopped playing their songs, claiming to protect public decency. What they were really protecting was the illusion of racial purity. Music by Ray Charles, Little Richard, and Fats Domino carried joy, heartbreak, and the pulse of real life. But it also carried power. It brought people together across color lines, and that terrified those who wanted the world to stay divided. By erasing black voices, broadcasters tried to erase the truth that their rhythms had built American music itself. But sound travels farther than censorship. You can ban a record, but not a revolution set to music. When Allen Ginsberg wrote Howl, he was not trying to shock the world. He was trying to tell the truth. The poem's raw voice, its open talk of sexuality and suffering, was unlike anything the 1950s had ever seen. Authorities called it obscene and hauled it into court, convinced that words could corrupt a nation. But what Howl really exposed was the fear of honesty itself. It was the cry of a generation suffocating under conformity, yearning for something real. The trial made it famous, and suddenly the poem that was meant to be silenced became the anthem of the voiceless. You can ban a book, but not a feeling that refuses to die. The Kinsey reports did not just study human sexuality, they shattered America's polite illusions about it. When Alfred Kinsey published his findings, people were horrified to learn what their neighbors were actually doing behind closed doors. Churches denounced him, politicians demanded his books be banned, and libraries quietly pulled them from shelves. The idea that sexuality was not black and white, but a spectrum, was more than the 1950s could bear. Yet for countless people, Kinsey's work was a mirror they had never been allowed to look into. The outrage said less about science and more about shame. The truth was out there. It was just too uncomfortable to face. Few novels have ever caused as much uproar as The Catcher in the Rye. When it appeared in 1951, school boards raced to remove it, claiming its language was vulgar and its attitude anti-establishment. But what they feared most was not the words. It was the honesty. Holden Caulfield's voice was too real, too lost, too human for a decade built on pretending everything was fine. The book gave teenagers a vocabulary for loneliness and frustration, and that scared adults who could not explain their own. Every ban made it more irresistible. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can give a young person is the truth. Television in the 1950s had one rule above all: keep everything spotless, even if that meant lying. Networks rejected any script that acknowledged divorce, calling it too adult for family viewing. Married couples on screen had to stay married, even when their stories begged for realism. Writers fought quietly behind the scenes, slipping hints of broken homes or lost love into dialogue. They knew that real families watching at home were already living those stories. Every omission was a reminder that television cared more about illusion than truth. Writers who dared to suggest a character might be divorced were told to rewrite or walk away. To the studios, divorce was not just personal failure, it was contamination. America was still clinging to the dream that every home had two parents, a white picket fence, and eternal happiness. Showing anything else would have broken the illusion. But behind that illusion were millions of viewers quietly living the very lives television refused to show. In trying to protect its audience, television only made them feel more alone. The ban was not about family, it was about pretending everything was perfect, even when it was not. When Lucille Ball became pregnant in real life, I Love Lucy faced a crisis of language. The word pregnant itself was considered too explicit for national television. CBS executives demanded that writers use expecting instead, as if the mere sound of the word might scandalize living rooms. Religious groups even sent letters demanding that the pregnancy storyline be canceled entirely. But Lucille Ball, never one to bow quietly, insisted on showing her real experience to millions. Her courage broke one of television's strangest taboos, proving that laughter could make even fear look foolish. Yet audiences already knew. Lucy Ricardo was going to have a baby, and America was watching history unfold. The show's handling of the pregnancy was tender, funny, and groundbreaking, but behind the laughter was a strange discomfort. A woman's natural condition had to be softened, sanitized, and hidden behind euphemism. The irony was that the episode celebrating new life had to tiptoe around the very word that defined it. For a country obsessed with morality, the fear of saying pregnant revealed something deeper, the terror of acknowledging that innocence and intimacy could coexist. In 1960, audiences gasped at the shower scene in Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, but that was not the only part that caused outrage. The film showed something no major American movie had ever dared to show before: a flushing toilet. It sounds absurd now, but at the time, such an act was considered shockingly indecent. Letters poured in accusing Hitchcock of vulgarity, even though the scene lasted only seconds. Some theaters refused to play the film unless it was edited, terrified of public scandal. Hitchcock, grinning behind the camera, had found the perfect way to expose how ridiculous the rules of decency had become. Bathroom scenes were thought to cross a line between private life and public shame. Hitchcock fought the censors, insisting it was part of the story's realism, not an act of rebellion. But the argument revealed the decade's true obsession: control. If even a toilet could be deemed immoral, then what else in daily life was quietly forbidden? Psycho forced audiences to confront what they were not supposed to see or even think about. In that sense, the film did more than terrify. It exposed the strange fragility of 1950s respectability. Television kisses in the 1950s came with a stopwatch. According to the National Association of Broadcasters, any on-screen kiss that lasted longer than 3 seconds risked violating moral standards. Romance had to be chaste, polite, and preferably interrupted by a laugh track. Couples were even shown sleeping in separate twin beds, as though sharing a mattress might corrupt the nation. Writers joked that love was the one thing American television could not do right. What passed for passion was more like a handshake disguised as affection. Directors cut away early, and writers found ways to show affection without actually showing it. For couples, passion was censored down to politeness. What was lost in the process was not just realism, but tenderness. Viewers were taught that love should be modest and brief, that desire was something to hide rather than share. The rule might have been written in the name of morality, but it left a generation with a strange lesson, that even affection had an expiration date. The 3-second kiss became a perfect symbol for a decade afraid of feeling too much. The Man with the Golden Arm was one of the first American films to confront heroin addiction head-on, and it paid the price for telling the truth. Starring Frank Sinatra as a recovering addict, it showed withdrawal, relapse, and the messy struggle of human weakness. Censors called it indecent, refusing to approve it for release unless the drug scenes were cut. Frank Sinatra fought publicly for the film, arguing that people needed to see what addiction really looked like. Critics hailed it as a masterpiece, while conservative groups labeled it moral poison. For a brief moment, cinema stopped pretending, and that honesty terrified the gatekeepers of purity. But cutting them meant cutting the story itself. The point was to show what addiction looked like, not to pretend it did not exist. The movie was eventually released without the official seal, and audiences were stunned by its rawness. For a moment, Hollywood's polished mask slipped, revealing the pain behind the glamour. The outrage it faced showed how desperate America was to hide what it did not understand. To admit that addiction existed was to admit that perfection was an illusion. On beaches across the United States, women were told to cover up or go home. The bikini, newly introduced from Europe, was branded as scandalous and immoral. Lifeguards measured fabric, police issued fines, and signs at resorts warned against indecent exposure. Some women were arrested simply for wearing one, their names printed in newspapers as examples of immorality. Yet photographs of those same moments spread across tabloids, sparking fascination instead of disgust. The more they tried to hide the body, the more America wanted to look. Yet the swimsuit itself was not the real issue. It was what it represented. A woman choosing to show her body was a woman claiming ownership of it. The bikini became a flashpoint in the battle between control and freedom, between public shame and private confidence. For every rule written to keep women modest, there were women quietly ignoring it, testing the water anyway. The beach became a line in the sand, not just between sand and sea, but between the past and whatever came next. Even the sidelines of a high school football game were subject to moral law. Cheerleaders in the 1950s were told that their skirts must fall below the knee, and that showing too much leg would distract the boys. Teachers kept rulers on hand, measuring hems to the inch. Girls began sewing their own uniforms shorter in secret, adjusting hems right before games. Some schools held public assemblies warning against provocative displays of energy, but those same performances drew the loudest cheers, proof that confidence could never really be measured by fabric. Parents signed dress codes, and principals threatened suspension for violations. The rule was never really about uniforms, it was about control. By turning modesty into a measurement, schools turned young women's bodies into public property. Cheerleading, once meant to show school spirit, became another arena for policing femininity. But the girls knew better. Each time a hem crept a little higher, it was a quiet act of defiance, a reminder that confidence could not be contained by fabric. In certain towns, a woman wearing pants was not a fashion statement. It was a public scandal. Restaurants refused to seat them, theaters turned them away, and in some places, police issued fines for improper attire. The logic was simple and cruel. Trousers were for men. Even Hollywood struggled with the shift. Actresses like Katharine Hepburn were criticized simply for showing up to interviews in slacks. In factories and offices, women quietly defied the rule every day, wearing pants for practicality and strength rather than glamour. Their courage turned comfort into a quiet revolution, one stitched hem at a time. Women were expected to stay in their dresses, as if fabric itself could enforce gender order. But the women who chose pants did so with quiet conviction. They were working, driving, living on their own terms. Every pair of slacks was a small rebellion against the rigid scripts of femininity. When you look at old photos now, women in crisp pantsuits, heads held high, you see more than style. You see courage disguised as clothing, a generation stitching its freedom one seam at a time. When the twist and the bop hit American dance floors, adults called it the end of civilization. Ministers condemned the hip movements, newspapers described them as indecent spasms, and police raided clubs that allowed them. The dances were joyful, spontaneous, and personal, everything the 1950s tried to suppress. In some towns, chaperones were hired to patrol school dances, standing stiffly as teenagers laughed and twirled around them. Radio hosts defended the new dances, arguing they were expressions of rhythm, not rebellion. But the more adults tried to stop the movement, the more it spread, proving that music always finds the cracks in control. In truth, they were simply reflections of a new rhythm rising in American life, one that came from the fusion of black music and youthful energy. But because the dances were unchaperoned and sensual, they threatened the moral code that kept pleasure under lock and key. Town councils banned them outright, claiming to protect youth while only deepening curiosity. And just like that, the twist spread faster than ever. You can outlaw a dance, but you cannot stop people from moving when they finally feel free. Teenage sock hops might sound innocent today, but to some 1950s parents, they were a moral crisis. Held in school gyms or church basements, these dances gave teenagers a rare space of their own. Music, laughter, and no adults hovering nearby. That freedom terrified authority figures. Local newspapers ran editorials warning that dim lights and slow songs were gateways to trouble. Parents formed committees to supervise every gathering, turning joy into a monitored event. Yet even under watchful eyes, the energy of youth could not be contained. Every step, every song was a quiet declaration of independence. Town councils warned that unsupervised mingling between boys and girls led straight to delinquency. Some schools banned them altogether, locking the doors to keep youth in line. But the bans only made the gatherings more exciting, more necessary. The sock hop became a small rebellion wrapped in rhythm, proof that even in a decade obsessed with control, the next generation was already learning how to make its own rules. Every band said the same thing without meaning to. The harder you try to stop youth from living, the louder they will dance. Beatnik coffee houses were more than just places to drink bad coffee. They were small explosions of free thought in a decade built on silence. Inside the dim light and the smell of cigarettes, poets read verses about love, war, and the hollow hum of conformity. The music was jazz, the talk was politics, and the feeling was freedom. Students and artists gathered shoulder to shoulder, their conversations stretching late into the night. Censors and police saw rebellion, but the Beat generation saw community, a space where truth could breathe. The clinking of coffee cups became the rhythm of resistance. But to city officials, these were un-American gathering spots, magnets for radicals and dropouts. Police raided them, citing fire codes and disturbing influences, while newspapers warned of moral corruption. What they really feared was not the poetry, but the possibility. Young people questioning the world they had inherited. The beatniks did not wear suits or smile politely on cue. They sat cross-legged, spoke honestly, and refused to apologize. And in a time when even words had to follow rules, that was enough to make them dangerous. In the 1950s, even knowledge itself could get you banned. Public libraries quietly removed books about communism, from Karl Marx's Das Kapital to neutral academic studies explaining its theory. The Red Scare had turned curiosity into suspicion. Teachers whispered warnings to students who asked about the banned titles, afraid their questions might be reported. Families burned books in their backyards just to prove their loyalty. Fear became the new literacy test. Read the wrong thing, and you could lose everything. Reading the wrong book could ruin a career, a family, or a name. Librarians were warned not to circulate subversive material, and teachers avoided assigning anything that might raise questions. The irony was painful. While America claimed to defend freedom, it feared free ideas most of all. A country built on open debate suddenly preferred silence to thought. By locking away books, it tried to lock away doubt. But curiosity has a way of finding its readers, even in secret corners. And for every title pulled from the shelf, there was someone out there still asking why. Lenny Bruce did not invent controversy, but he gave it a microphone. His stand-up routines tore into hypocrisy, religion, and the polite lies of everyday life. On smoky stages, he said what everyone else was afraid to think. Some clubs shut off the lights mid-show to stop his performances, while audiences shouted for him to continue. When police dragged him off stage, he often walked straight into the crowd to keep speaking. For Bruce, comedy was not just laughter, it was defiance in motion. Police raided his shows, arrested him for profanity, and called his act a threat to public decency. His jokes were dissected in courtrooms like evidence of a crime. But Bruce's real offense was honesty. He spoke in the raw, messy language of the world as it was, not the world television pretended it to be. The laughter he sparked was nervous, guilty, and liberating all at once. His words challenged not just censors, but the audience itself. In trying to silence him, authorities proved his point. Truth was obscene only to those afraid to hear it. Jazz, once the heartbeat of American cities, was treated like noise pollution by the moral guardians of the 1950s. Parks that once echoed with trumpets and saxophones suddenly fell silent. City councils claimed that jazz attracted the wrong crowd, a coded phrase for young people, interracial gatherings, and the kind of joy that defied order. Police showed up at concerts, watching crowds more closely than the musicians on stage. Many performers lost work as clubs canceled gigs under pressure from officials. But even when venues shut their doors, the music found back rooms, basements, and every hidden space where rhythm refused to die. Musicians were pushed to the outskirts, their music dismissed as dangerous. But jazz had always been rebellion in rhythm, born from struggle, shaped by improvisation, and carried by those who refused to stand still. You could ban it from a park, but not from the pulse of a city. On the edges of town, where rules grew thin, the music kept playing. The beat was freedom disguised as melody, and it always found a place to play again. In the 1950s, beer was fine to drink, but not to see. National television networks banned liquor and beer commercials altogether, claiming to protect family values. The idea of a father on screen holding a bottle was too risky, too real. Behind closed doors, however, beer sales continued to climb. Families were watching their favorite sitcoms with a cold drink in hand, quietly proving that censorship could not rewrite daily life. Advertisers found clever loopholes, showing glasses filled with golden refreshment that everyone knew was beer without saying it aloud. Advertisers turned to coded language and smiling actors sipping refreshing beverages, hoping viewers got the message. The rule was clear: alcohol could exist, just not in public view. It was another way of pretending that adult pleasures and problems did not belong in the perfect picture of suburban life. Ironically, the ban only made beer more alluring. While television stayed polite, America's living rooms were already filled with the quiet clink of glasses. The censors had protected no one. They had only hidden the truth in plain sight. Drive-in theaters were the crown jewel of post-war leisure until Sunday rolled around. Many towns banned them from operating on the Sabbath, calling them sinful recreation. The idea that families might watch a movie under the stars instead of attending church struck officials as a moral emergency. The bans were so strict that some drive-ins hired security to patrol their own lots, hoping to avoid fines. In some places, teenagers would sneak in after dark, watching films in silence with headlights off just to enjoy a sense of rebellion. To them, the glowing screen was not just entertainment, it was freedom flickering in the dark. Police would drive by checking for violators, while pastors preached about the decay of sacred values. But to most people, Sunday night at the drive-in was not rebellion, it was rest. A break from work, a moment of quiet joy, a shared laugh in the dark. By outlawing it, the authorities revealed something deeper: their fear that pleasure once tasted might be hard to control. The screen went dark, but the longing for freedom stayed lit. Pregnancy magazines and pamphlets were once sold quietly, if at all. Many stores refused to display them, calling the subject too private for public view. To talk about childbirth or women's health was to invite discomfort, even scandal. Editors received letters begging them to keep publishing, often from women in small towns with no one else to ask for advice. For many, these magazines were the only place where motherhood was discussed with honesty rather than shame. Every copy sold in secret felt like an act of self-education and quiet resistance. Expecting mothers had to ask for copies behind the counter, whispering like they were buying something shameful. Yet these publications offered vital information: nutrition, safety, care, that every woman deserved to know. The ban was not about decency, it was about control. Society wanted women to have children, but not to understand their own bodies. In the glossy silence of the 1950s, even motherhood was treated like a secret. Every hidden magazine was a quiet reminder that the truth about life itself was considered too improper to print. Before Marilyn Monroe was Hollywood's golden girl, she was a scandal on glossy paper. When her nude calendar photos resurfaced in the early 1950s, newsstands were ordered not to sell them, and papers refused to print her name. It did not matter that the photos were taken years earlier when she was struggling to survive. Morality police saw only sin. Behind the scenes, Monroe refused to apologize. She admitted to posing, saying she had been broke and needed to pay rent, and the public loved her honesty. That simple act, telling the truth, turned her into something new. A woman unashamed of her past in an era that demanded shame. But the public did not turn away. The controversy made her famous, transforming her from anonymous model to household name. The ban had the opposite effect. It turned shame into legend. For a nation obsessed with purity, Monroe became the perfect contradiction. Both sinner and saint, victim and icon. Her banned photos revealed the decade's greatest secret, that desire and denial often wore the same face. Even the word underwear was too much for the 1950s. Advertisers were forced to use euphemisms like foundation garments or intimate apparel, carefully avoiding any hint of anatomy. Store mannequins were draped to hide curves, and television commercials spoke in whispers about support and comfort. Designers privately mocked the restrictions, joking that Americans wanted to clothe their shame more than their bodies. Yet these ads still sold in record numbers, proving that people could laugh at the rules while obeying them. The result was an entire culture fluent in euphemism, able to talk around everything but never directly about it. The fear was not nudity, it was acknowledgement. To say the word underwear was to admit that people had bodies, that beneath the suits and skirts there was something human. The ban made shopping absurdly theatrical, a dance around the truth everyone already knew. It was a decade determined to stay polite, even if it meant denying the obvious. You could dress modestly, speak softly, and still feel the weight of everything left unsaid. In 1950s high schools, rebellion could start with a comb and a little too much grease. Boys who slicked their hair back into pompadours, greasers as they were called, were seen as troublemakers. Some schools banned the hairstyle entirely, claiming it symbolized gang culture and disrespect. Principals gave morning inspections, sending boys home until they fixed their image. Others fought back by bringing combs to class, fixing their hair defiantly after each warning. It became less about the hairstyle itself and more about proving that individuality still had a place in hallways built on conformity. Principals ordered haircuts, teachers sent students home, and barbers offered degreasing specials. But the style was not about crime, it was about identity. For working-class teens, that shine was armor, a small way to feel powerful in a world that told them to stay small. Every drop of pomade was a declaration. We exist, and we will not disappear quietly. The bans only deepened the divide between order and individuality. By trying to tame the look, the schools proved exactly why the boys wore it. Riding in the back of pickup trucks was one of the ultimate thrills of the 1970s. Kids and even adults piled into the open bed, sitting on wheel wells or dangling their legs over the edge as the truck sped down roads and highways. It was seen as harmless fun, a way to pack more people into a vehicle during summer outings, parades, or even just casual drives. No one thought about the lack of safety, and there were no laws stopping it. Children stood up to feel the rush of wind, holding onto the sides as the truck bounced over bumps. Families laughed together on hayrides or waved to neighbors during parades, treating it like a carnival ride. Even dogs joined in, tails wagging as they leaned into the breeze. For children, the wind rushing past and the feeling of freedom made it one of the most exciting rides of their lives. Parents sometimes even encouraged it, especially in rural areas where it was considered part of growing up. Today, the very idea of riding unrestrained in the open back of a truck on a freeway feels reckless and dangerous. But in the 1970s, it was a symbol of carefree childhood. No seatbelts in cars were just a fact of life in the 1950s. Families would pile into their station wagons, kids sprawled across the back seats, parents up front, and no one thought twice about safety restraints. At the time, cars were seen as symbols of freedom and style, not machines that needed strict safety rules. Most models were built for looks and comfort rather than accident protection. Lap belts technically existed in some vehicles, but they were considered optional extras that very few buyers bothered with. In fact, many drivers saw them as unnecessary or even dangerous, worrying that they might trap them inside during a crash or a fire. Looking back now, it is shocking to think about just how casual people were about driving safety. Parents would let kids sit on their laps while steering, or let toddlers nap in the back window shelf with the sun beating down. Police did not enforce seatbelt use because there were no laws to enforce. It was not until the late 1960s that seatbelts became standard equipment in American cars, and not until the 1980s that states began passing laws requiring their use. By then, decades of tragic accidents had proven the cost of going without. Still, to people who grew up in the 1950s, the memory of piling into the car with no restraints at all is strangely nostalgic. even though today it would be considered completely illegal and irresponsible. Drinking and floating on rivers without life jackets was summer at its most carefree and most dangerous. You grabbed a giant black inner tube, packed a cooler full of beer, and drifted with your friends down slow-moving waters for hours. No one wore a life jacket, most could barely swim, but it was never about safety. It was about the sun, the music, and the freedom to float with no responsibilities. Some tied their tubes together. Others threw a rope to a canoe hauling more drinks. The river became a party, and the risks were part of the fun. You might remember falling out and laughing, feet searching for the rocky bottom, arms flailing before someone pulled you back in. Today, alcohol use while floating or boating is strictly monitored. Life jackets are required for anyone under a certain age in most states, and adults can face citations, or worse, for ignoring safety laws. But in the 1980s, there was no lecture, no patrol, just a lazy current and a long afternoon. And while the river taught you how to stay afloat, the classroom taught something entirely different, often with a wooden paddle. Gasoline-scented model airplane glue was the secret sauce of childhood creativity and accidental intoxication. The solvent-heavy adhesive smelled like a gas station in July, sharp enough to make your nose sting and your eyes water. Kids would crack open the tube, squeeze out a glob, and before you could say ventilation, they'd be glassy-eyed and dizzy. This wasn't your average school glue, it was packed with toluene and other solvents that evaporated quickly, creating fumes that went straight to the brain. And back then, no one batted an eye. Parents assumed the lightheadedness was from excitement. In reality, kids were unintentionally getting high. Some took it further and started sniffing glue on purpose, leading to a whole wave of accidental addiction. It became a national concern. Stores put warning labels on the tubes. Glue brands changed formulas, but the damage was already done. For a brief moment, model kits were less about airplanes and more about buzzing in the back of your brain. That sharp chemical tang became the background scent of many basements, garages, and bedrooms. It stuck to your fingers, your clothes, and your memory. And the toys? Well, they often stayed unfinished because the builder was too loopy to finish gluing on the wings. But if model glue seemed risky, just wait until you see the next toy that looked exactly like a real weapon, down to the shell ejection. The typewriter, with its rhythmic tap-tap and the ceremonial ding at the end of a line, was the soul of written communication. From Mark Twain to the Beat Poets, it was the instrument of choice for crafting narratives. The introduction of electric models, like the IBM Selectric in the 20th century, was akin to moving from a horse-drawn carriage to a sleek automobile. Yet, the dawn of personal computing in the late 20th century gently ushered this stalwart into the shadows. Still, the typewriter remains a symbol of creativity and nostalgia, cherished by those who yearn for the tangible imprint of ink on paper. In the 1980s, airplanes had smoking sections. Passengers could light up mid-flight, filling a pressurized cabin with smoke while hundreds of strangers sat inches away. Ashtrays were built into every seat, and the smell lingered long after a flight landed. Families flew cross-country while sitting in rows divided only by a flimsy sign that said, "Smoking" and "Non-smoking." In reality, the smoke drifted everywhere, making the entire cabin smell like an ashtray. Flight attendants walked the aisles, serving coffee in one hand and collecting cigarette butts in the other. Health concerns were raised, but airlines continued to allow it, catering to the smoking culture of the time. Children coughed quietly. Non-smokers complained, but the majority accepted it as unavoidable. It was simply part of flying in the 1980s. Today, the thought of someone lighting a cigarette on a plane is absurd and illegal. Do you remember looking up through a haze of smoke while cruising at 30,000 feet? BB guns and pellet guns, treated as toys, reflected a time when safety concerns were far less strict. Kids received them as birthday presents or bought them with allowance money, then ran into backyards or fields to play wars without goggles or supervision. The guns looked real, fired small projectiles, and caused plenty of injuries, but that never slowed their popularity. Children lined up cans on fences, tested their aim on bottles, and sometimes even shot at each other in mock battles. Bruises, welts, and chipped windows were common, but few parents saw them as serious problems. Instead, BB guns were viewed as a training step before hunting or using real firearms. Parents often shrugged it off as part of childhood, seeing it as a step between toy cap guns and real hunting rifles. Children learned to aim, to shoot at cans or bottles, and unfortunately, sometimes at each other. It was dangerous, but it was also seen as normal, even character building. Today, strict regulations, bright safety markings, and bans on certain models make them far different from what they were. In the 1970s, though, BB guns were simply toys, symbols of a looser and riskier time. Lead paint-coated homes, furniture, and toys throughout the 1950s. Bright, durable, and cheap, it seemed like the perfect material for parents who wanted colorful nurseries or sturdy cribs. Toy makers splashed it on blocks, model cars, and dolls without hesitation. The sweet taste of lead paint chips, as many survivors recall, made the danger even more insidious. By the late 1970s, the health consequences became undeniable, and lead paint was banned for residential use. Today, homes built before those bans often require costly inspections and lead removal projects to make them safe. In the 1950s, it was just another Saturday project to repaint the family home. What was considered normal then is now recognized as one of the greatest household hazards of the past century, and it serves as a stark reminder of how much has changed in just a few decades. Mercury thermometers were a household staple, used on babies, adults, even pets. Tucked in bathroom drawers or first aid kits, they were slim, silver, and dangerously beautiful. If you were sick, your mom would shake the thermometer to reset the mercury, then slide it under your tongue or arm. You waited in silence, watching the silvery liquid rise and hold its place. Nobody questioned it. It was science. It was routine. But those thermometers were filled with mercury, a potent neurotoxin that could poison the air if the glass broke, and they often did. A slip from the counter or a hard shake could send beads of mercury rolling across the floor like tiny balls of doom. Most families wiped them up with tissues or brooms, unaware of the harm. Today, mercury thermometers have been almost entirely phased out, replaced by digital ones that beep instead of shimmer. But for kids of the 80s, that little glass stick was part of every fever, every flu, every call to grandma for what to do next. And just like nobody questioned the mercury, nobody questioned mixing alcohol with open water, especially when summer meant floating down a river without a care in the world. Back in the 1970s, asbestos was the miracle material nobody questioned. It was fireproof, heatproof, durable, and completely packed into everyday items like ironing board pads. If you were ironing your Sunday best or pressing collars for school, chances are you were standing over a big square of asbestos without even knowing it. The logic back then was that if something could handle heat, it was good. And asbestos? It could handle just about anything, except your lungs. That stuff did not just stay in the pad. It crumbled, it flaked, it floated right up into the air and got breathed in over and over again. Still, no one thought twice. Moms would lean over the ironing board, kids running around, windows shut, and steam rising up like a sauna of danger. It was not until years later that we figured out those innocent little chores came with a free side of cancer risk. And speaking of leaving kids in questionable situations, sometimes they were not in the house at all. Sometimes they were left in the car, alone, with the windows rolled up. Home hair dryers in the 1960s looked like they came straight from a beauty salon, but without any of the safety checks. These early models had bulky hoods or handheld nozzles, often with thick cords that frayed faster than a worn shoelace. You'd plug them into the wall, perch near the bathroom sink, and hope for the best. No ground wires, no insulation. Just you, your wet hair, and a live current a sneeze away from disaster. The metal casing got hot. The motors sparked occasionally. And heaven help you if your fingers were damp. Water plus faulty wiring? That hairdo could turn into a fireworks show. Yet people trusted them because that sleek salon look felt worth the risk. back then it was just another day in the name of glamour. But if electricity was playing with fire, what we put directly on wounds wasn't much better, especially when it came in a bright red bottle with a mercury surprise. Playgrounds in the 1980s were built less for safety and more for durability. Swings, monkey bars, seesaws, and towering metal slides stood proudly on surfaces paved with asphalt or concrete. If a child fell, and they often did, the impact was hard and unforgiving. Metal slides scorched bare legs in the summer sun, and merry-go-rounds spun so fast they sent kids flying. Monkey bars stretched high, daring children to climb higher than they should. Cuts, bruises, and even broken bones were part of the package, and kids wore them like badges of honor. Parents rarely intervened. A scraped knee was rinsed with a hose, and kids went right back to climbing. Teachers supervising recess barely blinked at children tumbling onto blacktop. Today, playgrounds are built with padded surfaces, rubber mulch, and strict regulations. Looking back, it is astonishing to think how casually kids once played inches above concrete. Do you remember hitting the asphalt, shaking it off, and running back to the swings without a second thought? Drinking age of 18 in many states was a reality that shocks people today. In the 1970s, teenagers who had barely graduated high school could walk into a corner store, hand over a few dollars, and buy a six-pack of beer without question. It was legal in dozens of states, and for many, it was a rite of passage. College towns thrived on it, with freshmen celebrating their new freedom not just with dorm parties, but with legal trips to the bar. Parents often shrugged it off as part of growing up, and bartenders rarely turned anyone away as long as they had the cash. The culture of the time simply did not see alcohol as something that needed to be as tightly regulated as it is now. Campaigns against drunk driving had not yet reached their peak, and laws varied widely from state to state. For those who lived through it, the memory of grabbing a beer at 18 still lingers as a sign of how relaxed society once was. It feels almost unthinkable now, but in the 1970s it was just normal life. Doctors prescribing amphetamines for dieting was shockingly normal in the 1950s. Known as pep pills, these stimulants were handed out to patients, especially women, as a quick fix for weight loss and fatigue. Pharmaceutical ads in popular magazines glamorized them as safe and effective, often showing slim, smiling women as proof of their power. Many general practitioners wrote prescriptions casually, with little thought for long-term consequences. For housewives juggling children, housework, and social expectations, the pills promised energy and appetite suppression. In an era obsessed with appearance and thinness, especially for women, the popularity of amphetamines skyrocketed. Few people realized the addictive qualities or the toll on physical and mental health. It was only later, when dependency and abuse became undeniable, that stricter regulations began to rein in their use. Today, prescribing amphetamines in such a casual way would be illegal and unthinkable. Yet in the 1950s, it was just another visit to the doctor's office where patients left with bottles of pills meant to boost their mood and shrink their waistline. Looking back, it feels unsettling that something now so tightly controlled was once marketed like a simple vitamin. This was a time when trust in medicine was high and the culture of quick fixes overshadowed caution. The legacy of those prescriptions still lingers, a reminder of how blind faith in convenience sometimes comes with hidden costs. No seatbelt use was not just common, it was practically invisible. Cars came with seatbelts, but they were rarely used. Children piled into the back seat without a second thought, curling up with pillows, playing games, or hanging their heads out the window like golden retrievers. On long trips, siblings would wrestle or lie down to nap across the entire back row. Adults, too, often left their belts untouched, especially in the front passenger seat. The seatbelt light was just an annoying feature, easily ignored. There were no alarms, no relentless dings, just silence and freedom. Many people viewed seatbelts as unnecessary unless they were driving fast or on highways. Some even believed they were more dangerous during crashes. It was not until the late 1980s and early 1990s that states began to enforce seatbelt laws. Today, it is a non-negotiable. Not buckling up can cost you money, your license, or your child's safety. But back then, you were more likely to get in trouble for forgetting to bring home milk than for not wearing a belt. And if the roads were that casual, imagine how carefree kids were on their bikes, zooming through neighborhoods without a helmet in sight. In the 1980s, the idea of just a few beers before driving was shrugged off by many as no big deal. Bars often had crowded parking lots late at night, filled with cars whose drivers had been drinking most of the evening. Police might pull someone over if they were swerving badly, but casual drinking and driving was still socially tolerated in ways that feel shocking today. Back then, it was not uncommon for adults to finish up at a local tavern, slide behind the wheel, and head home without a second thought. Even small-town festivals often had beer tents with people drinking freely before hopping into their cars. The danger was always there, but the culture treated it as routine. Friends might joke about someone being fine to drive, even when they clearly were not. The truth is, accidents happened often, but the public's attitude was different. Campaigns against drunk driving were only starting to gain momentum, and the phrase "designated driver" was not yet part of everyday vocabulary. Today, even one drink can put you in legal jeopardy behind the wheel, but in the 1980s, it was still seen as normal. Looking back, it is unsettling to realize how casually people risked lives, chalking it up to part of the night out. Do you remember when "just a few" was the excuse everyone used? School field trips without permission slips seem impossible today, but back then it was a common practice. Teachers would gather the class, take a quick head count, and pile everyone onto a bus for a trip to the zoo, a museum, or even a factory tour. There were no stacks of paperwork, no emergency contact lists, and no signed forms tucked into backpacks. Kids were often surprised to find out where they were going only once the bus started moving. Some students came home covered in dirt from farms or dazzled by machinery from factory tours, retelling stories to parents who had no idea the trip even happened. The spontaneity made the day feel like an adventure, adding to the thrill. Parents often did not even know where their kids were going until the child came home with a story to tell. It was a time when trust in schools and teachers was nearly absolute, and communities felt smaller and safer. The idea of liability or lawsuits was far from people's minds, and permission was assumed rather than documented. Looking back, it feels carefree but also risky. Children traveling across town with little more than a roll call to keep track of them. Yet for many kids, these trips became some of their best memories of school, precisely because of that freedom. Asbestos was everywhere in the 1950s. It was woven into the very walls and floors of homes, schools, and public buildings, and no one thought twice about it. The fibrous mineral was cheap, fire-resistant, and strong, making it a favorite material for insulation, ceiling tiles, floor tiles, and even toys. At the time, few people linked the mineral to the lung diseases and cancers that would later devastate entire generations. By the 1970s, medical research had revealed the dangers of asbestos exposure, and regulations began phasing it out. Today, its use is banned in many forms, and strict removal procedures are required if it is discovered in old buildings. Looking back, it feels chilling to realize how something once considered a household necessity is now recognized as one of the most hazardous building materials ever used. What was normal then would never be allowed today. Fireworks for kids were not just available, they were encouraged. You walked into a gas station, handed over a few dollars, and left with a brown paper bag filled with firecrackers, bottle rockets, and Roman candles. No ID check, no warning label. You lit them with matches, your fingers trembling with excitement. Sometimes you held them too long, sometimes they fizzled out, other times they exploded in your hand. But that was part of the thrill. Neighborhoods erupted with smoke and booms. Adults watched from lawn chairs. Kids ran barefoot across driveways, shrieking with glee and barely avoiding burns. There were no goggles, no supervision, and almost no laws to stop it. Today, most states restrict fireworks sales to adults. Certain types are banned entirely, and child safety campaigns have all but erased the image of kids with sparklers and pocket lighters. But in the 1980s, fireworks were a childhood staple, dangerous, loud, and unforgettable. The risk was part of the fun. Just like cracking open a cold beer on a public beach once felt like a harmless way to enjoy the sunshine, before open container laws shut that down too. In the 1980s, sticking out your thumb on the side of the road was considered practical, not reckless. Hitchhiking was part of everyday life, especially for teens trying to get to the mall, workers without cars, or college students heading home for the weekend. Parents often reminded their kids to be careful, but they rarely forbade it. Back then, the culture trusted strangers more. A kid could hop into a passing car and be dropped off at school or a friend's house without much worry. Stories about hitchhiking dangers existed, but they felt distant, more like urban legends than reality. Most people saw it as a cheap, convenient way to get around. Drivers often viewed it as neighborly duty. Picking up a hitchhiker was framed as helping someone out, not risking your life. Teenagers even bragged about their hitchhiking adventures, treating it as a milestone of independence. Today, the idea of letting a child climb into a stranger's car is unthinkable. Laws, awareness campaigns, and tragic headlines ended the practice, replacing it with strict warnings. Looking back, it is chilling how normal it once was. Do you remember when a thumb outstretched on the roadside was all the transportation you needed? Drinking and driving viewed casually is perhaps one of the most jarring shifts from the 1970s to now. The phrase "one for the road" was not just a joke, it was an accepted practice. Many cars had built-in ashtrays and even cup holders designed with beer cans in mind. People drove home from bars with open containers in the passenger seat, and no one batted an eye. It was common to see beer cans rolling under seats or tucked in glove compartments, evidence of how normal it was. Even passengers joined in, sipping drinks on highways as if it were no different from having a soda. Roadside checks were rare, and the culture itself downplayed the risks. Police were far less strict, and DUI laws were weakly enforced compared to today. It was not unusual to see someone sip from a can of beer while cruising down the highway. The cultural mindset was shockingly relaxed about the dangers, partly because campaigns about drunk driving had not yet taken hold. Families sometimes even joked about dad having a few too many, but still driving home. Tragic accidents eventually led to tougher laws and greater awareness, but in the 1970s, casual drinking and driving was simply part of the culture. Cigarette vending machines were once a familiar sight in the 1950s, found in restaurants, bowling alleys, bus stations, and even hotel lobbies. All it took was a handful of coins, and out slid a fresh pack of cigarettes. Children could and often did purchase cigarettes directly from these machines without anyone stopping them. At the time, smoking was so normalized that no one thought vending machines were inappropriate. As the dangers of smoking became undeniable, governments began to regulate vending machines more heavily. By the 1990s and 2000s, most states banned them altogether except in adult-only venues. Today, the thought of a child pulling a cigarette pack from a machine feels absurd, but in the 1950s, it was part of daily life. That casual access is exactly why this once normal practice is now completely illegal. Children riding in the front seats of cars was an everyday sight, and often a point of pride. Sitting up front made you feel older, more important. You got to fiddle with the radio, point at road signs, and chat with mom or dad like a co-pilot. No one thought about airbags because there were not any. Booster seats were rare, and height limits did not exist. Some kids were barely out of diapers, sitting inches from the windshield. It was not defiance, it was just convenience. Parents wanted to keep an eye on you, or maybe you just begged until they said yes. You might remember leaning over to see the map or falling asleep with your head against the door. Today, it is illegal in many states for children under a certain age or weight to ride in the front seat. Airbags are now both a safety feature and a reason for strict backseat policies. But back then, the rules were unspoken and the risks were invisible. And if you think sitting up front was bold, try remembering what they used to hand to kids on the 4th of July. Explosives in a paper bag. Station wagons in the 1980s were rolling playgrounds for kids. With no seatbelt enforcement and wide, flat cargo spaces, children sprawled across the back on long road trips. Some built forts with pillows and blankets, while others simply slid around as the car took turns. Parents rarely insisted on seatbelts, often ignoring them altogether. Kids jumped from seat to seat, played games, or napped, stretched out across the back seat. For families, road trips were noisy, chaotic, and strangely joyful, even though they would be considered unsafe today. The lack of restraint came with consequences, but most families considered it normal. Seatbelt laws were only just beginning to be enforced, and public attitudes had not yet caught up. To many, buckling up felt unnecessary, something only overly cautious people worried about. Looking back, it is astonishing that entire families barreled down highways with children rolling around the car. Do you remember lying flat in the back of a station wagon, staring up at the stars through the rear window? Every band tells the story of a fear we outgrew. So tell us which one shocked you most. Tap that like button if you believe curiosity always wins, and subscribe to keep uncovering the truths they once tried to hide.